Another week, another workplace trend. First, it was the great resignation, then it was quiet quitting, then it was quiet firing, and this time it's the rise of the Flexitariat. A recent Bloomberg article proclaims say hello to the Flexitariat, empowered employees who want a change. The desire for flexibility, an employee employer power shift, and the death of the commute are defining the latest work era. This so-called flexitariat is apparently made up of white-collar workers who value the ability to work remotely and prioritize greater work-life balance above all. Bloomberg states, "Today, the unquestioning drudge, hemmed in by the commute, has been replaced by a highly assertive worker who puts freedom and flexibility at the center of their working identity." According to the piece, this new class of assertive worker has been made possible by a rebalancing of power between employers and employees that occurred during and after the pandemic. What's more, Bloomberg argues, is that white-collar demands are becoming a contagion that may indirectly increase the power of frontline workers, too. It's true, of course, that during the pandemic, plenty of white-collar workers suddenly found themselves working remotely and genuinely enjoying not having to commute to an office. But the fact that some employers are continuing to allow knowledge workers to work from home doesn't exactly mean that bosses have less power and workers have more. In fact, there's no reason to think that employers won't be able to take advantage of remote work. For one thing, some research has already suggested that working remotely can increase productivity, and during the pandemic, people working from home actually tended to put in more hours doing work than they had when they were working from a designated office. And while, yes, some companies are now pressuring workers to return to the office, others have quickly realized that they can save on overhead by just having employees work out of their own homes. One recent study has also found that employers are increasingly using remote work as an excuse to pay employees less. As NPR reports, a majority of large companies, those with more than 250 employees, and companies in finance and insurance, real estate, information, and professional and business services say they're using remote work policies as a tool to appease workers and tamp down demands for raises. But the biggest advantage of all for bosses when it comes to the so-called flexitariat, particularly at a moment when public approval for unions is higher than it's been in 60 years, might be that a remote workforce is one that's inherently harder to unionize. For instance, we already know that the lack of a centralized shop floor is part of why it's so difficult to organize workers like home care aides, seasonal farm workers, and Uber drivers. And even in a white-collar context, the seeds of a union drive often begin with informal conversations in the physical office, whether it's coworkers blowing off steam in the break room or chatting while passing in the hall or walking to lunch with each other. And for all the talk of white-collar workers' demands paving the way for others, it's still the case that flexibility for low-wage workers tends not to mean the freedom to dial into Zoom meetings from the couch, but more often means temporary work or gig work, unstable work schedules, and employers doing anything they can to classify workers as, quote, independent contractors in order to skirt labor laws regarding wages and benefits. This is all to say that workplace trends come and go, but in capitalism, employers always maintain the upper hand in the absence of a strong labor movement. Things like union density or rates of collective bargaining coverage might not be 100% perfect measures of worker power, but they're certainly more reliable than clinging to vague trends, whether that's quiet quitting or the rise of the flexitariat. Finally, I also have to mention that this, of course, isn't the first time that people have gotten excited about a supposedly new classification of worker. 10 years ago, in a fledgling publication called Jacobin, a writer named Bhaskar Sankara critiqued the notion of a precariat, which was at the time the hottest concept concerning the evolution of the workforce. Thinkers like Guy Standing argued that neoliberalism had created an emerging class of workers called the precariat, or people stripped of stable full-time jobs and forced instead to rely on short-term and temporary gig work to make a living. But as Bhaskar pointed out back in 2012, precarious low-wage employment wasn't really a new invention of neoliberalism. In fact, it's kind of just the default for how work has been throughout most stages of capitalism. The one exception in the US was the New Deal and post-war period when wages and job stability were high and the middle class was growing. And what exactly made those work conditions possible during that era? A fighting labor movement and working class struggle. Which is all to say that those who rush to identify a new kind of work or worker can sometimes miss the forest for the trees. But at least back in 2012, those who used the term precariat understood the ways that flexibility and decentralization could end up being advantageous to bosses and not just convenient for employees. The recent celebration of the rise of a new flexitariat, on the other hand, simply mistakes a limited white-collar trend for actual empowerment. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.